Just testing whether or not the stream is coming on. It says I have a green light, hopefully. Yes, it appears that the stream is now on. So today we're going to be talking about tools and techniques of web development. This is our live stream topic that we're going to be talking about today. Not just web development, but also programming as well in general. First of all, I would like to say thank you ever so much for the subscribers, the recent subscribers that have come on board, not just to the YouTube channel, but also to Twitter, Facebook, and all the other places as well. Thank you very much for watching and subscribing. I'm glad you're finding these videos and the tutorials that I do helpful. To all the new subscribers, my name is Peter Fisher. I'm a freelance web and mobile applications developer. I've been one for several years. And what I usually do on this channel is on the Tuesday, I have a tutorial, and we've been working on a Python tutorial series, or course, shall I say. That goes out on Tuesdays. On the Wednesdays, we have a live stream like this, where I discuss a particular topic to do with programming or web development. And of course, on the Fridays, we have a pre-recorded show. Last week, we did one on the controversies in the Linux community at the moment. So do follow along. If you haven't subscribed already, do consider subscribing, because I talk about a lot of stuff to do with how one can improve as a web developer or as a programmer, generally speaking. Today we're going to be talking about tools and techniques. And as a freelancer, there's been all sorts of tools and techniques that I've used over the years. I should say that this week I've been doing all sorts of work towards a deployment of certain projects, and so there has been a level of tooling that I've had to get to grips with, because some of the tooling wasn't what I had expected or used previously. So there is a little bit of learning that has happened this week. There's also been an awful lot of meetings as well, and you just have to roll with it. You know, as a freelancer, you just sort of work at the beat of their drum, in the sense of when they want to have meetings around these sort of deployment times, which is perfectly fine as long as you can fit it in yourself. So there's been a lot of talk. I would probably say there's been more talk than there has been coding. Although one thing I would say is that it's good to talk and plan about the deployment and talk about the techniques and talk about the tooling of that before you go ahead and just jump in and do stuff. I mentioned in the previous two live streams we had clean coding, and we had I can't remember what last week's was. It was clean coding. That was the first one, and then after that, we were talking about how one can just generally improve. And there has been sort of a series going on in the back of my head where we are talking about how one could become a better developer. And this topic of tooling and techniques is actually quite a fundamental topic. It's quite a big topic to talk about. So we're going to be sort of deep diving into this a little this in this live stream. I've been also doing stuff with coding, although it's been sort of more wash up type stuff. So lots of sort of fixing of issues that had been there for a very long time in certain projects, which has been great. But like I said, planning is something that is the thing that has really happened today. Or this week. It's been sort of planning for the code to come, and we do a lot of planning as developers. Often we think that we just program, but in fact we plan and we strategize and we consider all the possibilities, and we read code more than we write code, and we we try and be in a position where one can, when they get to the writing of code and building and developing the thing, you already know what it is that you're developing. You've already thought through the processes, what could possibly go wrong, that kind of thing. And I think that's a great thing, because what you end up doing is it kind of, it does, I'm not going to say it works first time, but you're comfortable with the solution that you've come up with. You're not just sort of hunting around for the solution that you're not just sort of just diving in and writing code here and there. You're actually thinking about it. But so that's basically what I've been doing this week. I've been planning, I've been creating diagrams, I've been talking about how one could go forward with certain projects, and it's been interesting. It's actually quite exciting, because you end up as a programmer getting really excited about the things that you're going to do, because you've already talked about it and you've discussed it and you've gone down different avenues. There was a lot of whiteboarding, that kind of thing, which I find fantastic and interesting. But yes, tooling. What is tooling? What is techniques when it comes to web development, when it comes to programming? What are the differences? Because often new developers coming on, they will approach the whatever they're trying to build with the mind of trying to find the best tool for the job, which is perfect, right? That's the way you need to think about it. But a lot of people will get so hung up on the tooling that they are using instead of considering the techniques that are used. So I put a tweet out this week, and it was a sort of a mysterious tweet, I suppose you could say, where it was comparing a hammer and a screwdriver. So I said something along the lines of both a hammer and a screwdriver can do the same job, in the sense that you can hammer in, you can bash in a nail using the butt of the screwdriver, and you can screw in a bolt using the claw of the hammer, using the corner of the claw of the hammer. You can screw bolts in like that. So they both of those tools can do the same thing. However, one wouldn't dream of turning a bolt using a screwdriver, using a hammer, sorry, nor would one consider to bash in a nail using a butt of a screwdriver. I mean, I think most of us have had that sort of thing where they've had to put in a nail into the wall or something, like a picture nail, and they haven't had something at hand to bash in, so you use either your thumb or whatever. But it's the act of doing that is the technique of turning a bolt. That is the thing that you can use in all of those tools. The technique of bashing in a nail as well, of that, putting in that force, that is the technique. The tooling comes later, because if you don't have a screwdriver, if you don't have a hammer at hand, then you will come up with a solution to do that, but the technique stays the same. So the problem people get into, I see, is that people think about the tooling instead of the techniques. They consider what tools they ought to be using, rather than the how that tool should be used in the environment that they've been given. And a lot of people get hung up on the tooling, and a lot of people get shunned because they're using tooling that perhaps isn't the right tooling for the job. But perhaps they have to use that level of tooling. But anyway, what am I talking about in terms of tooling? I'm talking more to do with the libraries that we use. I'm talking about the languages that we use. I'm talking about the frameworks that we use. You can do all sorts of stuff, or you can use all sorts of stuff to create the same website. It could be WordPress, it could be Concrete 5, it could be completely bespoke. The tooling that you use to do that will alter how rapid you build that, how flexible it is, sure, but the technique is still building upon, building a website using, say, certain methodologies, certain deployment techniques, that kind of thing. And as a freelancer, none of my clients necessarily care too much about the tooling. They don't care if it's in WordPress or if it's in Concrete 5, as long as they can adapt their techniques of updating the website to whatever tooling is used. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is the distinction between both tooling and techniques. Now, you can get quite abstract in this, because let's focus on the tooling first. You can get quite abstract there, because you can say, well, the tooling that I'm using is the IDE in which I'm coding my project, but that IDE does not have any impact to whatever it is which is finally being deployed. You could be in an office where you have 5, 6, 7, however many developers all developing on different IDEs, but producing or altering the same project. So they could have different tools that they are familiar with, all producing or changing up the code. Hey Sabor, I hope you're well. I'm doing fine. I'm okay. Thank you very much for asking. So the tooling is it's kind of like with in terms of the tooling that we use, we obviously use the IDEs. We obviously use the way that we do. We have tooling for debugging. So whether if you're a front end developer, whether that is tooling of the web development toolbar, again, the technique of debugging and stepping through and seeing all of the variables and the watch point and the breakpoints and so forth, that is a technique, right? Of doing that. But you could use various different tooling to accomplish that. Also, you could, in terms of unit testing or testing, the actual tooling could be, I use Codeception because I'm a PHP developer. I've used Mocha and JUnit and Jasmine and all of that other funky stuff for the JavaScript. But the actual method of technique of actually writing a unit test, having something that is expected, and check that. So checking a value against something that is expected, that is the technique of unit testing. So it doesn't matter what kind of tooling you're using, because you're still going to be writing that conditional check regardless of what tool that you use. Also, deployment. So you need to somehow get your code from your local machine over to the production box or the staging box or whatever. And so you might go through a pipeline, a build pipeline, and that build pipeline may have different tooling to check, test the code, do some linting, maybe build the documentation and all of that. But that pipeline is going through a series of deployment techniques that have been tried and tested. So with the techniques, you can go abstract as well. Like it's not just the techniques of okay, this needs to be deployed and therefore it needs to go through a build pipeline. We need to use these kind of techniques to control the source, to our kind of way of tagging the stuff, and then compiling all the bits and bringing in the assets and all of that jazz. Fine, but you can also talk about what is called universal stuff that is stuff that has been written about in terms of how one should I don't know, how one should deal with a certain situation, how one should have levels of principles, follow standards, that kind of thing. So, for example, with programming, you have a series of principles that you can or cannot, you might not follow. So here I'm talking about the solid principles. The solid principles, they don't require a tool. They are just principles that one should, as a programmer, know. And you could apply those principles to many programming languages that use object orientation. Object orientation is itself a programming technique. It doesn't have any dependency on the programming language. Obviously, it needs to be object orientated, but it's not saying that you cannot use this technique with this programming language, nor the solid principles. If you have an object orientated language, then you can apply those principles to that to whatever it is that you're building. And so one should learn the techniques and then worry about the tools later. They should choose the tooling that will allow them to work with the techniques in the easiest way. And like I said, as a freelancer, I am exposed to both a lot of techniques and a lot of tooling. And I've seen the same techniques being used in many different tools. So for example, even like pushing to a Git repository, that is a technique of pushing it to source control. But you could either use the command line for that, or you could use an IDE for that. And again, it's agnostic to the platform. It could be Windows, or it could be Linux, or it could be Mac, for example. So I've just been asked a question. Sabor Hassin has said, "Sorry for disturbing, but you tell me about the Android app register form or web form. Any different or not?" Android app register form or web form. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that, Sabor. If you could give me a little bit more, sort of signpost me into whatever it is that you want to get to. I'm not a strict Android developer. I said I was a mobile app developer, but what I use for my mobile applications is Appcelerator, because that allows me to cross compile down the code base using JavaScript. So it's basically like a Titanium. So Titanium is the framework, and I can write code in JavaScript, and I can then compile that down to the native iOS and Android counterparts. So in terms of the web form and the Android app for registration, you would probably be going through an API to do that. And that API would probably, that API would have to adhere to certain standards. So SSL security, it would need to be probably an OAuth token, that kind of thing. So you get given a token back and maybe even a refresh token. So in terms of the difference between the two, I would probably suggest that the first one is that it is written in Java because it's an Android app, whereas the web form would be server-based. It could be Java, but it might be something like PHP, or it could be Python. But you should think of the Android device as the client, and then wherever you're pushing it to is the server. But I hope that kind of helps in a semi kind of way. Let me just grab some tea. If anyone else has got some questions, then do let me know, and I will try and either get back to get back to you as soon as I can, or I'll leave it to the end of the show. So tools and techniques are the difference between how one does something and how one actually does it, right? So, or uses whatever it is that they want to use to go ahead and do something. So a technique of storing stuff, as I mentioned before, to a version control system. Again, the tool would be Git, but you could use SVN. You could use other source control stuff. The technique of actually deploying to a system, you still need, it doesn't matter how you do it, you need to move code from one place to the other, and you need to test that, and you need to ensure that it works. So you need some form of staging. Again, that's a technique of building a build pipeline. And then you can sort of attach different tools to that. Gregor has just said, are you excited about PHP 7.4? I certainly am, and I'll tell you why. There is an RFC, and I must say I haven't checked on it recently, but I did a video about it a few weeks ago, and that is all about typed properties. So if you do check through my channel, you'll see that a few weeks ago I did a talk about typed properties that are coming, or hopefully will be coming into 7.4. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Going back to tools and techniques for a bit though, as a developer, I do see a lot of people worrying about the tooling that they're using, and they get so lost in this sort of tooling world that they get blinkered from the actual techniques that they're trying to achieve. One has to take a step back and go, is this tool actually doing the job that this technique requires? Because like I said, there are so many different tools out there that can do the same thing slightly differently, or allow you to achieve that technical goal. And I often get asked the question of what programming language should I be using for this particular application, and it's not a case of the what is my favorite programming language, because I don't have a favorite programming language, because I've always chosen the language that is more geared towards the needs of the project. I never go into an application thinking that this is the suite of tools that I'm going to use regardless of the application. I think that's a very dangerous thing to do, and a lot of developers do that, and they find themselves in this horrible sort of crowbarring things in kind of mentality, because their tools simply don't do what they need to do for whatever it is that they're trying to achieve. Now, when I go to buy books off of, maybe I go to a bookshop, or maybe I'm on Amazon or what have you, and I'm looking for programming books. If I was told that I could only come out of that bookshop with one book, so I need one book, and I can only have one book, and the only choices I have are Node.js, book on Node.js, or let's say React, right, and a book on domain-driven design. Which one am I going to choose? Well, React is very hot right now, so a lot of people would tend to go for that. However, in say 5 years' time, which skill set will I be more using? Will I be using the React? In 5 years' time, it might not even be the flavor of the month that it is at the moment. Or would I be using the knowledge that I've gained through my domain-driven design book about how one should design and architect a system using domains, business domains? It sounds boring, but I would choose a domain-driven design book, because I think that is more of a benefit to me in the long run. The thing is, with all these tooling stuff, the tooling can come out of date. I mean, there's been so many instances that I can think of in my. I mean, I started coding. I started coding in the professional sense, sort of after the 2000s. So, or that, I mean, I went to college and university in the 2000s anyway, but I was a freelancer then. And there's been so much change in terms of the tooling that we've used, but there hasn't been much change in the techniques that we're using. So when someone says to me, what is the easiest way I can actually grasp this programming stuff? What is the best way I can improve being a programmer? It's not focusing on the tooling, because the tooling will come and go. It's the techniques that one needs to learn. It's the how one can improve themselves in the knowledge of all of the programming paradigms that we have, all the principles that we've got, how one should go about the techniques of deployment, the reading books on use cases in terms of what went wrong, system design, all of that kind of stuff. Basically learning through the experiences of others through books in what they're trying to do. So, for example, one technique that is just tried and true, and I go back to these universal truths, is incremental releases. So if you go ahead and go through like a waterfall mentality where you're just doing big bang releases all the time, then you are going to cause yourself a massive headache when it comes to, suddenly lifting and shifting a whole lot of code from one place to another place that hasn't been tested in the user's domain. You might have tested it fine, but because you're just changing so much stuff, that the user is going to get alienated, the user is going to get confused. Now, this incremental stuff might sound common sense to a lot of you, but it is a technique of how one should be developing and deploying code. And then what you start, your headspace then becomes, well, we're going to release often, and we're going to release very small amounts of code. And therefore you get the continual integration where you're using certain tools that might listen to your source control, and depending on which branch that you want to release into, maybe it watches for commits into that, and then it deploys the code automatically. Before that, it could be doing a whole bunch of tests. It could be building the documentation. That is just a technique of rollout. And so you need to get to, you as a developer, one needs to appreciate all of these techniques, all of the different ways that one has to think about through the development life cycle of a project. What is the technique of estimating? What is the technique of reading code? What is the technique of creating comments? What is the technique of architecting a system that suits a series of requirements? And how should one use a technique to ensure that those requirements are acceptable? I've not talked at all about the tools there. I've just talked about the development lifecycle. So, and having an appreciation of that really does benefit you as a developer. I remember when I first released my first project, and everything I was doing was just completely new. But the more I did it, the more knowledge and experience that I took with me, and that is the whole point. A tool could die, could just not be supported anymore, and therefore you're not going to be using that tooling ever again. But the techniques that you learn, that you will always be able to bring forward, because they are universally true, or some of them are universal truths. So when I was at university, there was, one of the first things that my lecturer mentioned was that the stuff that you learn in your first year will be out of date by the fourth year. And he made a a funny comment saying that, it's because of the hardware changes often, but in actual fact, it's because the software changes, and especially in the JavaScript world where things change quite rapidly. I have projects that run various different libraries at various different versions, and I know that if I was to work on one of those projects, then I would like to update those to be more of a up to date thing, right? It's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. I mean, we've altered the way programming works to be components, plug-inable components, and they all have different versions that we need to maintain support. Now, one program. I mean, I learned Java. I learned. Well, I'm not going to go into the whole list of stuff that I learned, but one of the languages that I learned whilst I was at university was a language that hopefully none of you would have to deal with. Hopefully none of you will have to use anymore because it's not supported. And if you do use it, then I do hope that you go to your client or your boss or whoever and just say, you know what, you shouldn't be using this. You should be using something else. And that is ActionScript. I say it's a language. It's kind of an offshot from JavaScript. It is the way that Flash, that animation thing. For the new people in here, it's all about, it's animating the rich media. I remember I had a book on rich media, and I learnt, I was learning ActionScript. And that was part of one of my projects that I had to do at university, was create a bunch of computer games using Flash, and then sort of creating event listeners and all of that stuff using ActionScript. Basically, it was like Macromedia's spin-off of JavaScript that could do a lot of animated stuff. These days, you would do all of that in JavaScript anyway, and CSS, and nobody should be using Flash anymore. So there, I've learnt in the space of a few years a programming language that I will never use anymore. Now, that you could see that as a shame, and yes, I guess it is a shame, but I haven't. That's not throwaway knowledge, because before that I learnt one of the first languages I learnt was VB6, and then I learnt Java, PHP, C, and all of that stuff. And each time I was learning those languages, I was bringing what I had learnt, the techniques that they used, to the other languages. So, for example, how one creates arrays, how one stores certain values, how one makes connections to external data sources, how one manipulates things on the screen, that kind of thing. And so when I went from one language to another language, I knew what an array was. I knew what a variable was. I knew how to use control flows and how to work around and manipulate certain things and change the flow of the application. I knew that. And all I was doing was learning the syntactical sugar that the language has. I was able to take with me the knowledge of the techniques of the actual of building that application. I knew at the end it needed to be deployed, and therefore I knew that it needed to be tested. It needed to go through some sort of user agreed testing. I knew it needed to be documented, so I knew the start, the middle, and the end, if it were. So I kind of like I kind of miss ActionScript in its weird way. I wouldn't mind just doing something just to sort of see if I can remember the craziness of the syntax. But I was able to take with me all of those things, and it just makes you more of a well-rounded developer, because you start to learn the nuances of the different languages. You start to learn and have a better appreciation for the way the languages do different things. But the the thing is that you can worry so much about the tooling, and the tooling could go away. Like ActionScript went away. That is the tool that I was using. But without having that knowledge and understanding of object orientation, and having that appreciation for how one needs to architect systems. So in my classes, what I did was I actually created class diagrams. And those class diagrams were just the techniques of me architecting these classes that I was building an ActionScript. But you could take that and use that class diagram in any programming language that was object orientated, because you were using a technique of creating classes and structuring your system in a way that is object orientated. You're not concerning yourself with what it is that you're actually programming in. And I have also used things like NetBeans. I've used Eclipse. I've used Sublime. I'm a PHP Storm developer, so I'm not a developer of PHP Storm. I use PHP Storm as my main development thing at the moment. But I've never been sort of brand loyal. I've never hooked onto one particular IDE, nor have I hooked against one kind of source control thing, because as a freelancer, it's very difficult to say this is all I'm going to be using from now on out. I certainly don't want to be typecast, and I certainly don't want to be turning down work just because they're using a tool that I'm not happy with. Because I think that one has to adapt to the client's needs. But you can once you start decoupling what the techniques are between the tools, then you can actually start sort of boiling it down, condensing what it is you're doing down. I built, for example, the other week, the Secret Santa that I was using for my family. Basically, it was just an array of, well, it was a list of people's names, and it shuffled them and sent out the emails. I could have used any kind of tooling I wanted that I know of to do that. I chose Python, and I think next year I'm going to do perhaps Ruby or C. But the technique of creating a list of names, looping through those names, and then doing the array pop to get the name off and remove it from the array. That is a technique of reducing an array in a loop, in a while loop, that I can take with me to the various different programming languages that I'm aware of. And that piece of knowledge is something that is more important, I feel, than actually understanding that you need to have a semicolon at the end of such and such, otherwise it's going to break in JavaScript, or closures can't be serialized. That kind of stuff. The people fill themselves up with all of the tools because you can actually put brands to tools. I'm a JetBrains guy. I'm a NetBeans guy. I'm a JavaScript guy, but in actual fact, we're programmers, and we are doing awful lots of techniques that are similar and can be used in many different programming languages and different styles. So, Gregor Novak has said, at which point in a programmer's career do you think books like Code Clean Architecture are beneficial? That is a very good question, because when you are starting out as a developer, you end up being bombarded with so many different things. When you're coming at this cold, there are so many different bits and pieces, and you end up falling down a massive rabbit hole, and you learn something, but then you have to learn something else, and then you have to learn something else. And you'll never, ever get to a point where you know everything in programming, ever. So in terms of when do you think you should be getting books and learning these kind of things, I would say that you need to feel comfortable in the syntax. And you need to be comfortable in failing, because that is something that we do all the time. We should consider failure as actually moving forward, because once we fail, as in there is a bug, you need to fix it. And so by fixing it, you become better because you start learning where various bits are. Like, for example, where the log files are, where what this error code means, all of that kind of stuff, which just becomes muscle memory. So I think that one needs to have a level of that and then consider, right, now I know how to actually create a program. Now I need to actually go back over my code and see if I can make it 10 times better by putting in these principles. The thing is that once you start, I mean, it's what I call the Stack Overflow problem. Because if you ask a question on Stack Overflow, normally, you'll get a great answer, but they will mention something in the comments or something that one wasn't aware of. And so one Googles that and then goes down another rabbit hole. And you'll never get out of that rabbit hole because you'll always be curious. As a programmer, one needs to be curious and one needs to continue their learning journey. But it's knowing when to come out of that and go, you know what, I don't actually need to know that right now. So at the moment, as a developer who is new to the game, you are in control as to what you know and what you don't know. You don't know anything until you start knowing stuff. But you need to have a list, I think, of all the things that you would like to know. And then you add stuff to the bottom of that list when you start knowing things, because knowing things is going to drive you to want to know more, because people will be suggesting various bits and pieces. Like, for example, I used several buzzwords today: solid principles, clean coding, different types of pipelines, all of that kind of jazz. And people might be thinking, oh my God, I need to learn all of this stuff right away. Well, if they've only been programming for a week, then no, they don't need to know that. They need to know how to build an application first. And one thing I will say is that I didn't appreciate clean coding for a very long time. My code was horrible. It worked, and that is the point. When you are a programmer, you often do things, and when they work, you often, because of time constraints, you kind of just work on something else, the next feature that comes along. We as programmers need to appreciate that what we've done last week or last month or last year is never going to be perfect, because the techniques or the versions of things might change, or it could be an inefficient loop that you've created, and now suddenly the client has thousands and thousands of requests that you have to handle. So there's always that sort of looking back at your own work and refining it. It's kind of like an art. It's a craft, it's never a finished piece of work, in my opinion. So Sabor is asking about sign-up codes. Sir, can you recommend any book for me about sign-up codes? I want to use a sign-up on mobile with no password. Well, the no password bit is a little bit odd, because you need to have a level of user password. One thing you could do is you could do it through like an email thing. So you could have a sign up where they put in their email address, and then the API or whatever the backend system that you're using could send a link to the email address with an expiry on that link. So maybe it's a 24-hour link with a unique code, and then they when they click on that, they get asked to put in that unique code. And also, once that's verified and their email address has been verified, you can then create a password on that. But the reason why lots of people don't log out or log into things like Facebook on mobiles is because the sessions are so long on those kind of things. The cookies are so long on all of that on the web. Which is why, and they had an issue recently, I believe, where they had a bug, and so what they needed to do is remotely log everybody out, or a large portion of people out, and invalidate the sessions that people were in. So whenever they did a page refresh, although I think it was actually just on the mobile phones, so whenever they did stuff, it would come up and lock them out. One thing I use a lot is OAuth, and with OAuth you can create OAuth 2. You can create a series of clients, associate a access token to those clients, and if you wanted to, you could go into the back end and remove an access code, which means that the user's requests will no longer be valid. What happens is that the API has a token, a bearer token, that comes in through the headers, and that is being checked to make sure that that is a verified user. So what you do is you expire or you remove that access token, and therefore the request is always invalid until they sign up again. The way to get around access tokens, though, that do run out, because they should have a timer on it, is that you give them a refresh token, and that refresh token allows them to put in that token as the access token to get another token back. So it's kind of like a hop, skip, and a jump if you think of it like that. So you kind of say, this is your access token, and you have, say, I don't know, 3 hours or 2 hours on this access token, but here is your refresh token for you to then request another access token, and that way it's a complete seamless kind of thing. And yes, there is a level of security issue with that, because you're passing not only the current access, but you're also passing in the future access. But what you can do through the back end is just analyze and look at all of the access tokens that are coming through, and if you spot any suspicious activity, then you just cull the access from that. I'm going to just turn on the light because it's getting a little bit dark. That's slightly better, I think. Sorry about that. Security is an interesting thing when talking about tools and techniques, because there are different techniques to secure an application, and the tools that we use today are certainly not going to be the same tools that we use in say 5 years' time, simply because the hardware, there's always this race between the hardware. The hardware is getting quicker and faster to break encryption, and so you're constantly sort of fighting against that. So what we use today is certainly not going to be what we're going to be using, say, in 5 years' time. One has to accept that. However, the techniques of securing a system, having a username and a password, having an expiry date, a link with an expire on it, that is a technique of giving the user a unique URL that they can access to create themselves an account. That technique has been tried and trusted for a very long time. The tooling of actually generating that unique URL might change. The technique of sending that URL, it could be that email dies, so we send that link somewhere else to another tool. the technique of comparing an email address on a register form, because that is the unique identifier. The technique of forgetting a password, and then going through a series of secret questions, that one has to answer in order to get that back. Those things, those checks, those techniques to make sure that the person who has that link is the right person. Those techniques will, they'll change, they'll improve, and we'll probably end up having to do more stuff. But it will be a less infrequent change to the toolings that we use to generate that stuff. Same with for example, bcrypt. I know it now has a cost to that you can you can add a cost factor in, and a length that changes the size and the scale of the actual encrypted hash. But it might not. It might be that something comes out, another tool comes out that makes that bcrypt insecure, and therefore we need to come up with something completely different. But the actual idea of hashing a clear text password is something that has been used. That technique has been used and used for many years. So that's basically it. That's kind of my little spiel on learning tools versus techniques, and how one should be more concerned with the technique and less concerned with the tools that they use, and be more concerned with how the tool is going to make that technique that they've chosen to be the best and most efficient. I should say that I have been in touch, or I have there has been some work in the background with the howtocodewell.net website, something that I do talk about on these live streams. I have created different pages to do with the live stream, so do check that out. I've also updated the way the blog works as well, so do check that out too. And also I have been in touch with some companies who are interested in this channel, and they would like to provide different discounts to various things. One being Apress. Apress got in touch with me earlier this week, and said that they have a Halloween sale on all of their books, and it's a 40% off. So at the moment, there's lots of Java books and lots of database books that are available. I did say all of their books. I think it is all of their books, but when I had a look down the link, it was just the Java and the database books. But do check that out. They'll probably add to that, because in their email they did say all books. So do check that out. I'll put a link. I put the links down in the show notes, but I'll just put these down in the descriptions. I should say that these are affiliate links, so they will help me out too, which is nice. And the next one is, I mentioned SSL certificates. I have I have got a 49% off SSL certificates by a company called Namecheap. Now, I've used Namecheap before several times for things like various domains for various clients, and various other services like DNS and stuff. So if you're interested in that, do check that out. Put that in the links below too, and also links to the courses down below. One particular course that I have recently just finished is the Python control structures course. That course has 9 tutorials which teach you how to use control flows to manipulate and manage your program. And what I've been doing, as I mentioned in the previous streams, is I'll just put this in the link below, is I've been creating full courses, so a single video full of all of the all of the tutorials with time-coded links, so you can jump between which tutorial. So we're covering a lot of things with Python if statements, Python while loops, for loops, how to loop over things like lists and dictionaries, and so on and so forth. So do check that out if you're learning Python. But look, the light is starting to get really dismal here, and I'm going to shoot off because I'm going to actually go out for a run tonight. Hopefully, if it doesn't get too dark. But anyway, thank you ever so much for watching, guys. Happy coding. I'll see you again next time. Cheers. Bye.